Hello, welcome to the Leaders of Learning podcast. I'm your host, Ling Ling. If you've played computer games in the 20th century, you'd probably recognize this tune. Or this one. Games are prevalent in all levels of society. We play it on our laptops, our consoles, and even carry it around in our pockets. From the days of Tetris and Super Mario, the global gaming industry is worth $109 billion today. Mobile games take 42% of the market. Along with its rapid growth, corporate learning and educational institutions have adopted various game-based methods and technology. But can we effectively learn from games? Joining us is Siddarth Jain, the creative director of Playware Studios, a game-based learning company here in Singapore. How did you end up becoming the creative director of Playware Studios?
Well, I'm the founder of Playware, and I did not want to be the CEO. No, but seriously, I'm a lifelong gamer. Actually, I started my career back in 97, 98, 99, playing professionally games. And since 2000, I've been building games, entertainment games of all types. And in 2015, we came to shifted to Singapore, and as an entertainment company. But in 2007, we were approached by Ministry of Education to do some of the first early work in serious games, game-based learning in Singapore. And since then, we've kind of pivoted, and Playware has become a totally games for learning kind of company, and that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years, essentially.
What is it that you exactly do in Playware?
Playware is, like I said, a serious games company. We do all kinds of games. We do games for healthcare training. We do games for mainly around the concept of learning through games. So we work with all the way up from primary school, secondary school. We work with universities, polytechnics. We work with major corporates such as Bayer, Caterpillar, Unilever. We work with people like Resorts World Sentosa, Singapore Airlines, and so on and so forth. We kind of focus on this core idea of the use of games, technologies, and methodologies for learning. So I thought, kind of cover the entire spectrum, all the way from serious games into gamification. But our key focus is this idea of how you can learn more effectively using games.
So we often hear of the term gamification. The definition is generally incorporating game-like elements into non-gaming activities. Is it similar to what you do, or is it different?
Yeah, gamification is interesting. Actually, I think gamification means a lot of different things to different people. At its very core, the English construct gamification, gamify something, means make something into a game. Which kind of fits very clearly what we try to kind of define gamification as. So if you use techniques, motivational techniques, engagement techniques from games into non-entertainment related activities, I would say that you are gamifying those activities. Just like if you are using game technologies for non-entertainment related activities, we would consider them serious games. Because something as simple as, for example, progression. Your steps tracker provides you a sense of progression that lets you know where you are and therefore motivates you to do more. It doesn't have any, other than the fact that games, one of the key principles of game design is let the user know their progression. it doesn't actually use any of the game principles. So is it still gamification? A lot of people will argue yes. But so what I'm trying to say is like gamification in general is kind of, it's a loose definition of the idea of using, in my mind at least, the idea of using game design principles and philosophies to create non-game activities.
How is that different from serious-based game learning as what you mentioned? What is the difference? How does it look like?
So serious games, very clear, it's very clear definition. It's basically the use of game technology for non-game or non-entertainment related activities. So for example, you can use a game engine for visualizing an oil rig. It has nothing to do with motivation, it has nothing to do with engagement, but it uses game-based learning technologies. That's considered serious games. It's not really a game. There are transactional servers doing stock exchange activities that use multiplayer game servers. That's not really a game. The activity is not a game, but it's using a game engine. That's considered serious games application. So that's a separate kind of thing completely. This is where I think what we do, for example, we focus on game-based learning, and that's why things kind of get interesting with gamification, because pretty much everything we do has elements of gamification. And you're taking a training program, you're taking scenario-based learning, you're taking a case study, and you're making it into a game. Is it gamifying? Yes, you could call it gamifying. Is it serious games? Yes, you could call it serious games as well. So it kind of becomes very difficult to kind of clearly define these things.
I imagine that not all topics are suitable for the serious game-based learning, as the example you gave of the exploring the oil rig or something of the sort. So what kinds of, topics are more suitable for serious game-based kind of learning?
In learning itself, I define learning into two particular parts. I call learning as practice, which is basically the application of skill or the sort of acquisition of skill or improving skills. So basically that's practice, this one element of learning, and the other element of learning is basically knowledge, and the whole idea around memorization, the acquisition of knowledge, the recall of facts that are known. In general, games do much better with skill-based applications, skills-based training, procedures, learning how to do something. What are some other things to think about? Games are excellent platforms for taking a novice at a particular task and making them into a person who has experience with that task. This is evidenced with examples like the aviation industry is one of the early adopters of using games for training. They've been using simulations and games for training aircraft for a very long, aircraft pilots for a very long time. Similarly, the military has been using games for a very long time. Healthcare has been using games for a very long time. So what I can say quite clearly is that wherever there is a vocation involved, there's a job involved, somebody has to do that job, and you want to put across the experiences or skills that somebody requires to do those jobs, games will work extremely well. Also in K-12 education, things like thinking skills, 21st century skills, communication skills, teamwork are games are a very good vehicle for those kinds of learning.
What do you think are topics that are not so suitable for game-based learning? Because I'm sure there's some limitations that come with it as well.
If you wanted to make somebody better at recalling particular pieces of content, though, maybe memorization works better, or rote learning works better. That requires a clear recall of information. There are more efficient ways of making you remember that. One great example is there are people who actually play a lot of word games and actually are quite conversant with creating words very quickly with word games. But because most games have a feedback mechanic for when you get a word wrong, in everyday life they aren't very good at spelling or not very careful about spelling. While you could learn word construction and rapid word construction as a reflexive skill, you don't necessarily learn the discipline of writing the word down clearly or correctly if you're not doing it under a time trial. That kind of a thing, I think, in a non-gamified task could be done quite well. The whole idea behind games, the whole process of design pedagogy or the design methodology that we use for games is this idea of learning through trial and error in a safe environment. If you look at the Cope's learning cycle, for instance, as a learning cycle, that's one of my favorite examples. Actually, it's play, right? Active experimentation. What does it mean? You're in a situation, you don't know what you're supposed to do, and you try to do something. Concrete experiences, which means you get a result, you see something that you've done, right? Then you have abstract conceptualization, basically coming up with a plan, how you're going to do this, right? So all of this kind of fits very well into the idea of how we design games, right? The whole idea behind games is also, you're in a situation, you try something out, you either succeed or you don't succeed. If you succeed, you feel happy, and you try something slightly more difficult, and that's basically the process of play. So it kind of fits very well with these things.
If we look out into the market, of course, people talk about e-learning,
Mm-hmm.
people talk about m-learning, and I think the most accessible form of technology is video learning. So what can one benefit from game-based learning?
Okay, a lot of these technologies that you mentioned, for example, videos, or e-learning, or micro-learning, or basically any of these web technologies as well, are knowledge transfer platforms. And as knowledge transfer platforms, they're great, but they don't really give you a chance to practice anything, right? Games, on the other hand, are essentially practice platforms. In fact, I like to call them practice transfer platforms, right? To create a holistic understanding of any topic, you need both practice and knowledge, right? You can't say that in the vacuum of in the absence of any practice, somebody who is just very knowledgeable about a topic can perform. This is not true. We've seen this happen time and again. Incredibly qualified doctors who never actually performed a surgery are not able to perform surgery. It goes down all the way to an inexperienced salesman with all the product knowledge or all the process knowledge, without any practice, stumbles in front of a customer, makes a mistake. These things cost real money to organizations, right? So what you can do with game-based learning is you can actually make sure that the person performing the task in your front line of your organization actually has practice. And that's something games can provide. And a lot of the other sort of platforms that we mentioned in learning, they don't provide those things.
It sounds really interesting that game-based learning has all these different elements of knowledge transfer and skills and the opportunity to, like you say, practice in a safe environment. So let's say I'm an organization that wants to create a game-based learning just for my employees. So what is the process before for embarking on this journey of developing a game-based learning program for my company? What are the considerations that I need to take? What kind of limitations? How long does it usually take? And so on.
In my experience, I've been doing this for quite a few years now. In my experience, what I've seen is a lot of organizations not very practice-focused when it comes to their transfer of learning. Most organizations are guilty of this, basically more or less knowledge-focused. So you have some PowerPoint or you have some process sheet that you've prepared, and then you just leave your people to learn on the job. So you just say, okay, you call it OJT or whatever. And what you do is you throw them in the deep end, and if they make a mistake, there may or may not be a mentor or a manager to give feedback to them. Other than that, there is no real learning, and what you expect is that, okay, over the years, somebody would learn. Now, this used to work extremely well in kind of assembly line type situations where, there was a tight working community. The tasks were fairly physical, right? In today's workspaces, where a lot of the challenges that somebody gets in their workspace have to do with thinking, have to do with cognition, this becomes a problem. This actually becomes very, very dangerous, and actually it's one of those things that end up, organizations can end up losing a lot of money on. When we start talking about, with any organization, we start talking about building games for learning for them, the first thing that we try to ask them is, can you recognize your enterprise practice? What is your enterprise practice? What does, an individual person who's part of your team, what do they do in their everyday? So this job that you're trying to train somebody for, what does it entail? Now, some organizations, such as hospitals or hotels or airlines, have very easy, so they know what their frontline staff does. But other organizations, corporates, have a very tough time trying to figure this out. So that starts, the first conversation. So The first part of the conversation is, do you recognize what your enterprise practice is? Do you know how that can be transferred? How do you currently do that? Now, if you have some sort of training that you already do around the practice of your work, making that into a game is a piece of cake, right? But very often we have to develop not just the game, but the actual training curriculum around the transfer of that particular type of practice, which usually takes a little bit more time. And again, it depends from organization to organization. It depends on scale, and it depends on what their current training techniques are. We usually look at subject matter expertise coming from inside the organization, which is usually better for larger organizations. Smaller organizations don't recognize their own subject matter expertise in many ways, so it becomes harder. Or often they expect us to provide subject matter expertise, which again means that we have to go out and look for somebody in that field. Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I wouldn't say there's a one size fits all for how long it would take, but depending on how much preparation the organization has done into the thought or into the process of building a practice within the organization, it could take a fairly short amount of time, very long.
What is a short amount of time and what is a long amount of time in your world?
Okay, so for us, typically a short time means you can start building games within a week or 2 weeks from meeting people. Often, I have had examples where somebody has written a script, a case, a scenario, or sent me their training content, and that kind of almost automatically translates into a game, because that's something that they already practice with, right? It's a procedure for practice. So for me, it's very straightforward, adding the kind of shiny bits and making it look real and things like that. And so just basically replicating what they already do in the real environment, in the virtual environment. That's quite straightforward. Long means we've had conversations with customers where there's been like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, and all we're doing right now is still capturing what they want to train and how they want to train that. What is the correct way? Who's the correct audience? And sometimes that can take a very, very, very inordinately long amount of time. And I understand that as well, because like I said, not all organizations are practice focused.
Why are some organizations still fixated on the knowledge transfer and not realize the importance of practicing these skills? What is stopping them from seeing the importance of practicing the skills?
I think what it boils down to is that learning, again, the attitude towards learning in organizations, between organizations differ. Some organizations spend a lot of effort and time and money on learning in general. I'm not talking about game design, just learning in general. And they have, they've figured it out that, they're going to have issues like turnover, staff turnover, or they're going to be accessing new markets regularly, or they're going to, have customer opportunities that are very valuable, and you really can't play around with those opportunities. Those kinds of organizations would typically have a much better and much fairer, much clearer understanding of what they want to do, and in my experience, some sort of practice-based learning in play already. Organizations that, on the other hand, are not working in very competitive spaces or enjoy some sort of first mover advantage or governmental benefit or something like that, or have lots of very low value transactions, and their margins are difficult, and there's a lot of pressure on the bottom line, would be negligent of spending too much money or effort on learning. That's one way of classifying it, right? Again, certain organizations, for instance, insist that they hire experienced people, especially smaller companies. Frequently they say, okay, we're not going to hire freshers, we're not going to train somebody. Training is not our, it's not our portfolio, it's not one of the things that we do. Let us just find people who already know the job and who can come in and immediately do the job. Now, yes, in certain operation sizes, that's a viable strategy. and that works. Of course, for very large companies, the cost of acquisition of manpower itself can be very high. Again, like there is no one size fits all kind of, I think it depends on the organization's own priorities.
It sounds like you work with a large range of organizations, from SMEs to big companies, and I'd imagine it's from various, as you mentioned, from various industries like the hospital, the military, and so on. But the games-based learning industry itself, it's very, very niche. I cannot imagine, or maybe I don't know it enough, that you might have a lot of companies that play in this space. Maybe not. But what if I am someone who is interested in this industry and I want to be a games learning designer? So how do I go about becoming a games learning designer?
One of the big challenges that we faced is initially we, for example, tried to hire learning designers, people who have instructional design experience, to come in and look at whether or not we could work with them as game-based learning experts. We found that there's a lot of things to unlearn for those people. One of the big challenges that you have is game-based learning. Instructional design in general focuses on knowledge transfer, primarily, and knowledge transfer-based training. Pretty much every piece of e-learning that you can pick up talks about creating a scaffold and talks about the efficiency of transfer of knowledge in a way that somebody can actually participate or use an e-learning once and never use it again, and that's fine. They'll retain a lot of the knowledge. So knowledge retention is a main kind of skill over there. Game-based learning, on the other hand, actually has a completely different set of objectives. So game-based learning talks about creating expertise, creating practice, creating kind of an awareness of the situation. Therefore, when you design games with the idea that somebody will actually play that game several times over. It's completely the opposite end of the spectrum, right? So you're saying instructional design, typically e-learning is designed with this idea, somebody will do this once and have very long knowledge retention. In games, we're saying, we don't expect you to pass this once, we want you to try it again and again and again. Because the whole idea is about practicing your skills, right? So at the very, very offset, the design philosophies are quite different from each other. So we've struggled to find people with designing learning games off the bat, coming out of any kind of course or something. So what we've tried to do instead is we've tried to find people with training experience. And this is one of the things that kind of I kind of very strongly stand by. So if you've done live training before, if you've been a teacher, if you've done you know how to take a workshop, you know whether it's actor trained or not, it doesn't matter. I'm talking about any kind of person who's done extensive hands-on training, teaching. You start with that kind of person. Now you already are familiar. That person will already be familiar with things like engagement, the idea of having goals, lesson plans, and things like that. So he's familiar with learning terminology in general. Then we try to match that with somebody who already has a passion for games. Games are something, and passion for games usually means people who play a wide variety of games over a wide variety of platforms and have that exposure to what games mean, because games is such a large industry today. It's the largest entertainment industry in the world. And you may be playing a particular kind of mobile games and you think that that's all there is, but that's not all there is. There are massively multiplayer online games where millions of people play concurrently online. There are mobile games, again, also massively multiplayer. There are real-time games. There are turn-based games. There are physical games. How games play on consoles are very different from how games play on PCs, and are very different from how games play. There are games that are artistic games. There are games, a lot of people say all games are violent. No, there's a whole world of games that are about management simulations of different types, time management, resource management. There are all kinds of puzzlers. There's all kinds of games that are adventure games. There are sports-based games, racing-based games. So there's a whole range of different kinds of games available. So what we try to do is we try to find people who have a wide exposure with different types of games. Now, if we can match these two skill sets, so if you have somebody who has training experience and who has experience with a lot of different types of games, then we can actually start training them with the ideas of how to actually use games for training quite quickly. Right? So that usually takes like a couple of days, and they're usually familiar with how to do these things. That's how we kind of find. Now, if this, of course, doesn't answer your question of how can somebody get into this line. Well, having a good portfolio of games that you've played is definitely important. Anybody wanting to get into this field will understand that different games are useful for different kinds of learning. So for example, a match 3 is an excellent pattern recognition game, but you wouldn't be able to teach banking with it. Whereas a role-playing game, for example, is a great place to learn interpersonal skills, but isn't excellent for things like time management. So again, I mean, like if you go to something like Cooking Mania or Diner Dash kind of time trial game, time and resource trial game, it's excellent for understanding the overall, but doesn't let you see the nuances of the gravity of a particular dangerous task, say bomb disposal. It wouldn't work very well. So depending on the subject domain, you may need a completely different approach to the game design, which would mean that you need to be familiar with that kind of game design. So somebody trying to get into this field should definitely get as much experience as possible with different kinds of games, and that's on one side. And of course, like I said, if you want to get into any kind of instructional design principle, I think that you should start with having some experience with hands-on training, right? Actually conducting real training, because actually that's the best way to figure out how people learn.
I'm glad you brought up the different types of games, because growing up I've played a lot of those games myself, all those simulation games and so on. But is understanding the different types of games and training enough? Because I would imagine in a technology-based company, wouldn't you need technological skills like programming or graphic design and things like that?
So people who do art for games, for instance, are just game artists. That's a recognized profession. Today, you can get a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree in that. Same with game programmers. Programmers are programmers. A game programmer, in terms of skill set, isn't very different from an application programmer, or vice versa. Application programmers also can come into game programming. When it comes to game design, that's where the differences arise. So if you want to get into game art, for example, or game programming, there's a very set career path to achieve that. On the flip side, when you're talking about learning games, not all learning games need to be technology oriented. You can actually make very good learning board games or card games. You can make extremely good learning social games. I don't think that there is any one particular kind of skill, and I can't say that every learning game should be made with a Unity game engine or using HTML5 or using Unreal or any other technology. It depends very much on the situation. It really depends on what they need in terms of training. So in terms of technical skills, I think everybody should get as many technical skills as they can possibly acquire, because those are only in a set. I was just talking about the mindset.
That's actually very insightful, because when I think about game-based learning, I think about, okay, I need to know this programming language, or I need to know how to do graphics design. But it's also quite interesting that as in this field itself, we also need to learn how it's designed psychologically, how the users or the gamers go through the game based on the needs of what they need to learn and so on. So what do you see is the future of game-based learning? Because technology will keep improving, will keep developing and so on. Where do you see game-based learning going?
So game-based learning, I think, is here to stay. I don't think it's going anywhere. It's only going to gain strength from strength. I believe that pretty much all learning in general, eventually at some point in singularity, will be game-based. I have a very clear belief that all learning, all play is inherently learning. And most learning can benefit from play. What is, how I define a game, like I said, is a safe environment where you can try to, aspire for a skill, try to get that skill, and in a structured way, get feedback on whether or not you get that skill, and have some sort of reward mechanism and things like that. So that entire engagement is what I consider a game or play. A play can be a little bit more open-ended than a game. It need not have an objective. So that's the main difference between play and games. But it's essentially inherently about learning new skills. So I feel that as technology improves, as access improves, as people's understandings of what games are improves. When I started my career back in 2000, there was still a kind of games were a kind of a pejorative term. They meant something bad, or it was something that you wasted your time on. It was like life is not all fun and games. But people have started kind of the generation that grew up since that time actually grew up with games and embraces games. So, for instance, a lot of the people that I know of who are contemporaries of mine, who are also parents, have big libraries of games for their children to play, and participate in these activities concurrently. It was unthinkable for me when I was young to actually imagine playing a game with my dad, but I play games with my daughters frequently, and I know a lot of such families, a lot of families in my immediate social circle who do this as well. So as the stigma goes away, as people embrace it as a lifestyle, it's already become the largest entertainment game industry in the world. As people embrace games as part of culture, I think their role in learning is also going to keep increasing actively. As more and more organizations use more and more games, you will see that you will start getting very good empirical data that proves that having practiced workforces improves your chances for success, improves your efficiency as an organization, improves your profitability, which in turn will get further go ahead from managements worldwide for learning centers within organizations to embrace games.
Sounds like a bright future for Playware Studios as more and more people start to embrace games as a way of learning. I like how you say that play is essentially learning. Learning is essentially play. Thank you very much for your time, Siddarth.
Thank you.
That was Siddarth Jain, Creative Director of Playware Studios. Highlights from this episode and contact details of our guest is available on our podcast website at www.leadandlearn.co. That is www.leadandlearn.co. We will be taking a break next week for Chinese New Year. When we come back, our guest Mei-Lin Tan, who is the head of academic development at the Singapore Institute of Management, will be discussing about the challenges, strategies, and techniques to effectively transfer expert knowledge. If you enjoy listening to this podcast, take a moment to rate, share, or review us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you download your podcast. Every rating helps us to build credibility and attract new listeners. This helps us to keep making the show. This is your host, Ling Ling. Thank you for listening to the Leaders of Learning podcast.